August 1964, Los Angeles, California. The black Cadillac limousine moved through the afternoon traffic on Sunset Boulevard with the unhurried pace of a vehicle whose passengers had no need to rush toward destinations that would wait for them regardless of when they arrived. Behind the wheel sat George Raymond Hoskins, a 52-year-old black man who had been driving for Frank Sinatra for 11 years and who had become, in that time, something far more than an employee to the man he served. George had been hired in 1953, during the darkest period of Frank's career, when the voice that had made him famous seemed to be failing, and when the contracts that had sustained his lifestyle were disappearing with a speed that suggested permanent decline. Most of the staff had been let go during those difficult years, but George had stayed, accepting reduced wages and sometimes no wages at all because he believed that the man he worked for would eventually recover, and because loyalty, once given, was not something George withdrew when circumstances became difficult. The years that followed had vindicated George's faith. Frank's comeback establishing him as an even greater star than he had been before his fall and generating wealth that allowed him to reward those who had remained faithful during the lean times. George's salary had been increased repeatedly. His responsibilities had expanded to include tasks that went far beyond driving, and his position within Frank's organization had become one of trust that few others enjoyed. The limousine was returning from a business meeting in Beverly Hills, Frank seated in the back, reviewing documents that required his attention, while George navigated the familiar route toward the compound in the Hollywood Hills, where Frank maintained his Los Angeles residence. The afternoon was warm, the traffic was moderate, and nothing about the journey suggested that it would become one of the most consequential trips either man would ever take. The police cruiser appeared in George's rearview mirror approximately 3 miles from their destination, its lights not yet activated, but its positioning suggesting that the officers inside were paying attention to the limousine in ways that experienced drivers learned to recognize. George maintained his speed, his lane position, and his composure, understanding that black men driving expensive cars attracted scrutiny that their white counterparts rarely faced. The lights activated without warning, the cruiser's siren producing a brief whoop that signaled George to pull over, despite the absence of any traffic violation that might have justified the stop. He complied immediately, guiding the limousine to the curb with the smooth precision that characterized everything he did behind the wheel, and prepared for an interaction that he had experienced countless times during his years of driving in Los Angeles. Frank looked up from his documents when the car stopped, his expression shifting from concentration to curiosity as he noticed the flashing lights behind them. He asked George what was happening, and George replied with the calm resignation of someone who understood that explanations would not change the reality of what was about to occur. He was being pulled over, he said, for the crime of driving while black. The officer who approached the driver's window was a young white man whose nameplate identified him as Patterson, his bearing suggesting the confidence of someone who believed that his uniform granted him authority that superseded whatever status the vehicle's occupants might possess in other contexts. He demanded George's license and registration without explanation, his tone carrying contempt that he made no effort to conceal. George provided the requested documents with the deference that survival required from black men in such situations, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid any gesture that might be interpreted as threatening by an officer whose hostility was evident from the moment he approached the window. The interaction followed a script that George knew by heart, each exchange reinforcing power dynamics that the uniform represented and that his skin color made inescapable. Officer Patterson examined the documents with theatrical suspicion, as if expecting to discover evidence of crimes that would justify the stop that had occurred without legitimate cause. Finding nothing, he demanded to know where George was going, where he had been, and why he was driving a vehicle that he clearly could not afford on whatever salary he might earn through legitimate employment. The questions were insulting, their premises based on assumptions that revealed more about the officer's prejudices than about any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. George answered each one with the patience that decades of such encounters had taught him, providing information that he was not legally required to share, because refusing to cooperate would only escalate a situation that was already dangerous for someone in his position. Frank had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, his initial curiosity transforming into fury as he recognized the nature of what was occurring. He opened his door and stepped out of the limousine, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the encounter in ways that the officer had not anticipated when he initiated the stop. Officer Patterson turned toward the man who had emerged from the vehicle's rear compartment, his hand moving toward his weapon in a reflexive response to unexpected movement that his training had conditioned him to treat as potentially threatening. But the face he saw was one that he recognized immediately, famous enough that even someone whose cultural interests did not extend to popular music would have known who he was confronting. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on Sunset Boulevard in August 1964 involves one of the most dramatic confrontations between celebrity power and police authority in American history. An officer who thought he could humiliate Frank Sinatra's driver without consequence, and a response that reached the highest levels of Los Angeles law enforcement and changed how the department treated civilians. By the end of this story, you will understand why Officer Patterson's career ended that afternoon, and why the chief of police personally apologized to a black chauffeur. Francis Albert Sinatra had experienced police encounters from both sides during his lifetime, his early years in Hoboken having taught him that law enforcement could be either protector or predator, depending on circumstances that individual citizens could not control. His rise to fame had insulated him from the routine harassment that ordinary people faced, but he had never forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable to authority, wielded without accountability. His friendship with Sammy Davis Jr. had educated him about the specific burdens that Black Americans carried in their interactions with police, stories of humiliations and dangers that his own white privilege had allowed him to avoid, but that his empathy forced him to understand. The treatment that George was receiving was not novel to Frank. It was a manifestation of patterns he had heard described countless times by people he loved. The anger that consumed him as he approached Officer Patterson was not merely personal offense at the mistreatment of an employee, but moral outrage at injustice that he possessed the power to address in ways that most victims of such treatment could not. His fame created leverage that he had learned to deploy strategically, and the officer who had stopped George was about to discover what happened when that leverage was applied with full force. Frank demanded to know why his driver had been stopped, his voice carrying an authority that derived not from any official position, but from the confidence of someone who understood that the officer's superiors would be very interested in how this encounter was handled. The question was simple, but its implications were complex enough that Patterson hesitated before responding. The officer attempted to assert control, informing Frank that this was police business and that civilians should remain in their vehicles during traffic stops. The instruction was technically correct, but practically absurd given the circumstances, and Patterson's attempt to enforce it revealed how completely he had misjudged the situation he had created by stopping a vehicle whose passengers he had not bothered to identify before activating his lights. Frank ignored the instruction and repeated his question, this time with a precision that made clear he was documenting the exchange for purposes that would extend far beyond the immediate encounter. He asked what traffic violation had been observed, what probable cause had justified the stop, and what legal basis existed for the detention that was now occurring on a public street in full view of passers-by whose attention the confrontation had attracted. Patterson's responses were evasive, his earlier confidence evaporating as he recognized that the encounter was not proceeding according to the script that normally governed such stops. The power that his uniform typically provided was being neutralized by the power that Frank's fame provided. And the officer's training had not prepared him for situations where civilians possessed more effective leverage than he did. The backup that Patterson had called for arrived during this exchange, a second cruiser whose officers emerged to find their colleague confronting one of the most famous men in America over a traffic stop that had no apparent justification. Their intervention was not supportive of Patterson, but rather cautionary, their body language communicating concern about a situation that had the potential to create problems extending far beyond the jurisdiction of patrol officers. Frank noticed the dynamic between the officers and understood that Patterson's colleagues recognized the danger that their fellow had created through his reckless exercise of authority. He addressed the senior of the backup officers directly, asking whether this was standard procedure for the Los Angeles Police Department and whether the chief would approve of officers stopping citizens without cause and detaining them for questioning that had no legal basis. The senior officer's response was diplomatic but revealing, his acknowledgement that the situation seemed irregular, suggesting that he would not defend Patterson's actions if the matter escalated to departmental review. The distance he created between himself and his colleague was subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that some battles were not worth fighting, and that this particular civilian was not someone whose complaints could be dismissed. Frank demanded Patterson's badge number and name, information that the officer was required to provide, but that he surrendered with visible reluctance as he recognized that his career was potentially at stake, depending on what happened after this encounter concluded. The documentation of his identity transformed him from an anonymous authority figure into a specific individual whose actions could be traced and whose future could be affected by decisions made by people far above his position in the departmental hierarchy. George had remained in the limousine throughout this confrontation, his window now rolled down so that he could hear the exchange, but his body carefully positioned to avoid any movement that might provide justification for the violence that encounters between black men and police too often produced. His safety depended on Frank's intervention, and his trust in the man he had served for 11 years was absolute. Frank returned to the limousine and instructed George to continue driving, their journey resuming as if the interruption had been merely a minor inconvenience rather than a confrontation that would generate consequences extending far beyond the few minutes it had occupied. Patterson watched them go, his expression reflecting the recognition that his routine harassment had produced results very different from what he had anticipated. The phone calls began before the limousine reached Frank's residence, his mobile communications equipment allowing him to initiate the response that would transform a traffic stop into a departmental crisis. His first call was to his attorney, whose connections to city government provided access to decision-makers, whose intervention could ensure that the encounter received attention at the highest levels. The attorney recognized immediately the significance of what Frank was describing, the combination of racial profiling and harassment of a celebrity employee creating publicity potential that any competent administrator would want to minimize. He promised to make calls that would reach the chief of police before the end of the business day, beginning a chain of communication that would accelerate through the department with remarkable speed. Frank's second call was to a journalist whose coverage of civil rights issues had earned him respect among communities that police departments typically ignored. The information Frank provided was not for immediate publication, but for leverage, the threat of publicity creating pressure that would reinforce the formal complaints that his attorney was preparing to file. The journalist understood the dynamics that Frank was activating and promised to hold the story while the situation developed, his restraint contingent on outcomes that would demonstrate whether the department was willing to address the misconduct that had occurred. The arrangement was transactional, but also principled, both parties sharing an interest in accountability that aligned their efforts despite their different motivations. George arrived at the residence, shaken by an encounter that had been routine in its origins, but unprecedented in its development. He had been stopped countless times during his decades of driving, had experienced harassment that exceeded what Patterson had delivered, and had learned to accept such treatment as an unavoidable cost of existing as a black man in America. But he had never before seen someone intervene on his behalf with the ferocity that Frank had displayed. Frank found George in the garage, where he was inspecting the limousine for any damage that might have occurred during the stop, a task that was obviously unnecessary, but that provided occupation for hands that might otherwise have revealed the trembling that stress had produced. He told George that what had happened was unacceptable, that the officer would face consequences, and that no one who worked for him would be treated that way without response. The emotion in Frank's voice surprised George, who had grown accustomed to his employer's outbursts about professional matters, but who had rarely witnessed personal investment of this intensity. The anger was not performative but genuine, rooted in a sense of injustice that extended beyond the specific incident to encompass the entire system that had made such encounters routine for people whose skin color marked them as targets. George thanked Frank with a formality that concealed deeper feelings he could not easily express. Gratitude for protection that most black Americans never received, and that George had learned not to expect, regardless of who employed him. The decades of humiliation that had preceded this moment had taught him that dignity was something he had to provide for himself, because the world would not provide it for him. The response from the Los Angeles Police Department came faster than Frank had anticipated, the chief recognizing within hours that the situation required personal attention before it escalated into the kind of publicity that could damage his relationship with the entertainment industry, whose cooperation was essential for managing the city's image. His call to Frank's attorney expressed concern that bordered on alarm. Chief William Parker was a complex figure whose tenure had been marked by both modernization efforts and tolerance of misconduct that civil rights advocates had repeatedly documented. His department's treatment of black residents was a subject of ongoing controversy, and the prospect of Frank Sinatra adding his voice to critics who were already calling for reform represented a threat that Parker could not afford to ignore. The meeting that Parker requested occurred the following morning, Frank arriving at police headquarters, accompanied by his attorney and by George, whose presence Frank had insisted upon, despite the chief's preference for handling the matter without the victim of the harassment participating in discussions of how to address it. The inclusion of George was itself a statement about who mattered in the resolution that Frank was seeking. Parker's office was designed to project authority, its furnishings and decorations communicating the power that the man who occupied it wielded over the largest police force west of the Mississippi. But Frank's entrance shifted the room's dynamics, his celebrity creating a form of authority that Parker's official position could not supersede in the arena of public opinion, where this matter would ultimately be decided. The chief opened with apologies that were carefully worded to acknowledge regret without admitting liability. The language of institutional self-protection deployed by someone whose experience had taught him how to navigate controversies without making commitments that could be used against him later. Frank listened with the patience of someone who recognized tactical maneuvers when he encountered them. Frank's response was direct and undiplomatic, his voice carrying none of the deference that visitors to this office typically displayed when addressing the man responsible for their safety. He told Parker that apologies meant nothing without consequences, that Officer Patterson had committed acts that demanded termination rather than the administrative reassignment that the chief was obviously preparing to offer as a compromise. The demand for termination produced visible discomfort from Parker, whose authority over personnel decisions was constrained by union agreements and civil service protections that made firing officers difficult even when their misconduct was egregious. He explained these constraints with the condescension of someone educating a civilian about realities that insiders understood, but outsiders typically did not. Frank's response demonstrated that he understood the constraints perfectly, and that he was offering Parker an opportunity to navigate them rather than be destroyed by them. The publicity that would follow a story about racial harassment by an LAPD officer, combined with departmental refusal to impose meaningful consequences, would create pressure that would dwarf whatever difficulties termination might produce. The mathematics of the situation favored compliance. George sat silently during this exchange, his presence a reminder that the abstract discussion of procedures and consequences involved a real person whose dignity had been violated by someone who wore the uniform that everyone in the room was now discussing. His silence was more eloquent than any speech might have been, communicating volumes about the routine indignities that Black Americans endured from institutions that were supposed to protect them. Parker requested time to consult with his command staff, a delay that Frank granted because he recognized that institutional decisions required process, even when the outcomes were predetermined by power dynamics that made defiance impractical. The meeting concluded with an understanding that further conversation would occur after the department had considered its options. The consultation that followed was reportedly contentious. Senior officers divided between those who wanted to protect Patterson and those who recognized that the cost of such protection would exceed whatever solidarity it expressed. The chief listened to both perspectives before reaching a conclusion that prioritized institutional survival over individual loyalty. Officer Patterson was summoned to headquarters the following day, his arrival observed by colleagues who understood that the encounter with Frank Sinatra had produced consequences that their peer had not anticipated when he activated his lights behind a limousine whose passengers he had not bothered to identify. The meeting that followed was brief and conclusive. Patterson was offered the choice between resignation and termination for cause, the former allowing him to seek employment elsewhere, while the latter would permanently mark his record in ways that would make any law enforcement career impossible. The union representative who accompanied him advised acceptance of the resignation option, recognizing that the fight could not be won and that minimizing damage was the only remaining objective. The resignation was processed within hours, Patterson's career ending with a signature on documents that attributed his departure to personal reasons rather than the misconduct that had actually produced it. The face-saving language was a concession that Frank had been willing to make, because his primary objective was the officer's removal rather than his public humiliation. The news of Patterson's departure spread through the department with the speed that only gossip about fallen colleagues can achieve, the details of what had occurred on Sunset Boulevard becoming common knowledge among officers whose future conduct would be influenced by understanding what had happened to someone who had misjudged a situation with catastrophic results. Frank insisted on a second meeting with Chief Parker, this time to address the systemic issues that Patterson's behavior represented, rather than merely the individual misconduct that had triggered the crisis. The chief agreed to the meeting with reluctance that reflected his understanding that Frank's demands were unlikely to be limited to personnel matters. The conversation that followed ranged across topics that Parker would have preferred to avoid, including the patterns of harassment that black motorists experienced from his officers and the absence of accountability mechanisms that might have prevented or punished such harassment before it attracted the attention of someone with Frank's leverage. The chief listened with the patience of someone whose options were constrained. Frank's demands were specific: enhanced training on civil rights for all patrol officers, establishment of a complaint mechanism that would be accessible to civilians who experienced harassment, and regular review of stop data to identify officers whose patterns suggested racial bias. The demands were ambitious but not impossible, and Parker recognized that rejecting them would produce publicity that would make the Patterson incident seem minor by comparison. The agreement that emerged from this meeting was not publicized in detail, both parties preferring to avoid the appearance that police policy was being dictated by a celebrity whose involvement reflected circumstances rather than any formal authority. But the changes that followed were noticed by those who paid attention to such matters, and the connection to the Sinatra incident was understood even when it was not explicitly stated. George Raymond Hoskins received a personal apology from Chief Parker during a ceremony that was private, but that was documented by photographs that Frank preserved as evidence of what had been accomplished. The chief's words were formal, but his presence was significant. The head of the Los Angeles Police Department expressing regret to a black chauffeur whose complaint might otherwise have been ignored entirely. The tears that George shed during this ceremony were witnessed only by Frank and by the small group of department officials whose attendance had been required as a condition of the resolution. The emotion reflected decades of treatment that had denied him the dignity that was now being formally acknowledged, a lifetime of humiliations that this single moment could not erase, but could partially redeem. Frank's response to the ceremony demonstrated the depth of feeling that the incident had activated in him, his embrace of George communicating solidarity that exceeded the professional relationship between employer and employee. The hug lasted longer than formality required, its duration reflecting something genuine between two men whose connection had been strengthened by their shared experience of the injustice and its aftermath. The relationship between Frank and George deepened in the years that followed, the encounter on Sunset Boulevard having revealed the character of both men in ways that routine interactions never could have. George continued driving for Frank until retirement, his position secure not merely because of his skill behind the wheel, but because of the trust that had been established through crisis. The story of what had happened became known within the entertainment industry, contributing to Frank's reputation as someone who would defend those in his employ with resources that few employers could match, and with commitment that even fewer would demonstrate. The incident joined other stories that illustrated his fierce loyalty to people he considered his own. The impact on the Los Angeles Police Department was more difficult to measure, the changes that Frank had demanded representing steps toward accountability that might or might not have produced lasting cultural transformation. The harassment of black motorists did not end with Patterson's resignation, but the message that had been sent about the potential consequences of such harassment was absorbed by officers whose behavior was influenced by understanding of what could happen when the wrong victim was chosen. George's children and grandchildren grew up knowing the story of what had happened on Sunset Boulevard, a family legend that connected them to entertainment history, while also teaching them about the treatment that their grandfather had endured and the ally who had unexpectedly emerged to defend his dignity. The lesson was complex, encompassing both the injustice that had occurred and the exceptional circumstances that had produced a just outcome. The LAPD that had treated George with such contempt would face repeated crises in subsequent decades, its relationship with black communities deteriorating through incidents that made Patterson's harassment seem almost benign by comparison. The Watts riots of 1965, barely a year after the Sinatra incident, demonstrated how deeply the department had lost the trust of communities whose residents had experienced treatment that George would have recognized immediately. Frank's intervention had changed nothing about the fundamental dynamics that produced police misconduct, but it had demonstrated what became possible when power was deployed on behalf of victims who normally possessed no leverage. The lesson was specific to circumstances that could not be replicated, but it was also universal in its implications for understanding how change occurs in institutions that resist accountability. The documentation of the incident was preserved in files that Frank maintained about significant events in his life, materials that biographers would later examine for insights into the character of a man whose public persona concealed complexities that only those closest to him fully understood. The papers related to George's harassment revealed an aspect of Frank that his entertainment career did not typically display. Chief William Parker died in 1966, his tenure having included both the Sinatra incident and the Watts riots that would define his legacy far more consequentially than any encounter with a celebrity over the treatment of a chauffeur. His department continued under successors whose attitudes toward black communities varied, but whose institutional culture remained resistant to the reforms that civil rights advocates demanded. The limousine that George had been driving when Patterson stopped him was eventually retired from service, its replacement lacking the historical significance that the original vehicle had acquired through association with an incident that had demonstrated what was possible when celebrity power was deployed in service of justice. George kept a photograph of the car in his home for the remainder of his life. Frank Sinatra continued employing drivers whose backgrounds resembled George's throughout the remainder of his career, black men whose skills behind the wheel were matched by their vulnerability to harassment from police officers, who viewed expensive vehicles driven by people of their race as inherently suspicious. Frank's reputation for responding to such harassment protected subsequent drivers from the treatment that George had experienced. The story of what had happened on Sunset Boulevard was occasionally shared with these later employees, a warning about dangers they faced and a reassurance that their employer would respond if such dangers materialized. The protection that Frank provided extended beyond the incident itself to encompass a commitment that subsequent encounters would trigger similar responses. George Raymond Hoskins retired from Frank's employ in 1979, his departure celebrated by a gathering that included people whose connections to Frank spanned decades of entertainment history. The tributes that were offered acknowledged not merely his driving skills, but the loyalty he had demonstrated during Frank's difficult years and the dignity with which he had conducted himself throughout his service. Frank's tribute to George during this gathering included reference to the 1964 incident, his description of what had occurred serving as reminder to everyone present of the values that George embodied and that Frank honored through his response to the injustice that had been inflicted. The story had become part of how both men understood their relationship and its significance. George lived for another 15 years after retirement, his final decade spent in a home that Frank's generosity had helped him purchase, and in the company of family members whose lives had been improved by the income that George's position had provided. He died in 1994, his passing noted by obituaries that mentioned his famous employer, and the incident that had demonstrated the character of both men. Frank attended George's funeral, his presence at a service for a former employee signaling the depth of connection that their relationship had involved. He spoke briefly about the man he had known for over 40 years, his words acknowledging both George's professional excellence and the personal qualities that had made him far more than a chauffeur to the family he had served. The legacy of the Sunset Boulevard incident extended beyond the individuals directly involved to encompass lessons about power, loyalty, and the possibilities that exist when people with leverage choose to deploy it on behalf of those without. The story became part of how Frank Sinatra was understood, evidence of values that his entertainment career expressed, but that his actions in moments of crisis demonstrated more powerfully. The Los Angeles Police Department continues to struggle with the issues that the incident revealed, its relationship with black communities remaining contested despite reforms that have been implemented over the decades since Patterson's resignation. The fundamental dynamics that produced the harassment George experienced have proven more durable than any individual intervention could address. But the story of what happened when Frank Sinatra's driver was stopped for no reason remains relevant as an example of what becomes possible when power encounters injustice and chooses to respond rather than accept. The conditions that made Frank's intervention effective were exceptional, but the principle that his actions expressed, that dignity deserves defense regardless of whose it is, remains universal. The training reforms that Frank had demanded from Chief Parker were implemented gradually over the following years, their effectiveness debated by observers, whose assessments reflected their prior assumptions about whether police departments could be reformed through procedural changes or whether more fundamental transformation was required. The evidence was mixed, improvements visible in some metrics while others remained stubbornly resistant to change. The complaint mechanism that had been established as part of the agreement provided a channel through which civilians could report misconduct without depending on the intervention of celebrities whose leverage few could match. The system was imperfect, its independence questioned by critics who noted that police officers investigated complaints against other police officers, but it represented progress from the previous situation in which complaints had no formal process at all. The data collection requirements that Frank had insisted upon revealed patterns that confirmed what black residents of Los Angeles had long known from personal experience, that traffic stops were concentrated in communities of color, that the justifications for such stops were often pretextual, and that the consequences of encounters with police fell disproportionately on people whose skin color marked them as suspicious, regardless of their actual behavior. These revelations produced controversy, but not the immediate reform that advocates had hoped would follow from documentation of discrimination that could no longer be denied. The department defended its practices while acknowledging that improvements were possible, a position that satisfied neither critics who demanded fundamental change nor defenders who believed that existing procedures were adequate. George's experience became a reference point in these debates, cited by those who argued that celebrity intervention should not be necessary to produce accountability, that should be available to all citizens regardless of their connections. The fact that Frank's involvement had been decisive demonstrated both the possibility of justice and the rarity of the circumstances that had produced it in this specific case. The entertainment industry absorbed lessons from the incident about the power that its members possessed and the possibilities that existed for deploying that power on behalf of causes that extended beyond professional interests. Frank's example inspired some to become more active in civil rights advocacy, though most continued to focus on careers that left little time or energy for activism that might complicate their relationships with audiences whose political views varied. The relationship between celebrities and social causes would evolve significantly in subsequent decades, the engagement that Frank had demonstrated becoming more common as performers recognized that their visibility created platforms that could be used for purposes beyond self-promotion. The civil rights movement of the 1960s drew support from entertainment figures whose involvement raised awareness and generated resources that grassroots organizations could not have produced independently. Frank's intervention on behalf of George connected his personal loyalty to broader struggles for equality that were transforming American society during this period. The protection of one man's dignity aligned with movements demanding that all people be treated with respect, regardless of their race, creating resonance between individual action and collective aspiration that enhanced the significance of both. The documentation of the incident that Frank preserved included not only official correspondence, but also personal notes that revealed his emotional response to what had occurred. His anger at Patterson's conduct was evident in language that biographers would later describe as among the most intense in any of his private writings, fury that reflected both the specific offense and accumulated frustration with injustices he had witnessed throughout his friendship with Sammy Davis Jr. and other black artists. The notes also revealed Frank's awareness that his intervention was exceptional, that most black Americans who experienced harassment similar to what George had endured had no recourse beyond acceptance or resistance that might produce violence rather than accountability. This awareness complicated his satisfaction with the outcome, the victory feeling incomplete because it addressed only one instance of injustice, while leaving the system that produced it largely intact. His subsequent advocacy for civil rights causes reflected this understanding. Contributions to organizations working for systemic change, supplementing the individual intervention that had protected George. The money he donated and the attention he drew to campaigns for equality represented recognition that celebrity power alone could not transform institutions whose practices required sustained pressure from movements rather than moments. The training programs that were established following the agreement with Chief Parker continued long after the specific circumstances that had produced them had been forgotten by most participants. Officers who underwent instruction on civil rights and community relations had no knowledge of the traffic stop on Sunset Boulevard that had triggered the institutional changes they were now experiencing. The curriculum that was developed addressed both legal requirements and practical considerations, emphasizing that discrimination was not only wrong, but also counterproductive to effective policing that required community cooperation. The appeal to self-interest supplemented moral arguments that some officers might have dismissed as irrelevant to their professional responsibilities. George himself was invited to participate in some of these training sessions, his presence as a civilian victim of harassment providing concrete illustration of abstract principles that might otherwise have seemed theoretical to officers whose daily experience reinforced assumptions different from what the training was attempting to convey. His testimony was compelling precisely because it was personal rather than political. The officers who heard George describe what had occurred on Sunset Boulevard responded with reactions that varied from sympathy to skepticism, their assessments shaped by their own experiences and their assumptions about the credibility of civilians who complained about police conduct. But even skeptics found it difficult to dismiss a man whose employer's intervention had produced the resignation of the officer who had harassed him. The documentation that existed regarding Patterson's departure made denial impossible for those who might otherwise have questioned whether George's account was accurate. The institutional consequences that had followed the incident demonstrated that someone with authority had believed George's version of events sufficiently to take action that would not have occurred if the complaint had been unfounded. Patterson's subsequent career provided a cautionary tale that reinforced the training's message about consequences that could follow misconduct. His attempts to find employment in law enforcement elsewhere were unsuccessful, his resignation from the LAPD carrying implications that potential employers understood even without explicit explanation. The informal networks through which police departments shared information ensured that his history followed him. The civilian complaint mechanism that Frank had demanded continued to receive reports that revealed ongoing problems with police conduct despite the training and oversight that had been implemented. The volume of complaints fluctuated over time, increasing during periods when community organizations encouraged reporting and decreasing when such efforts subsided, but never disappearing entirely. The pattern of complaints painted a picture of a department whose culture remained resistant to change, despite procedural reforms that had been imposed from above. Officers who had absorbed attitudes toward black residents during their formative years in the profession proved difficult to retrain, their behavior reflecting deep-seated assumptions that workshops and lectures could not easily dislodge. George's case became one of the successes that administrators could point to when defending their department against critics who argued that complaints never produced meaningful consequences. The resignation of Patterson demonstrated that accountability was possible, even if the circumstances that had produced it were exceptional and could not be replicated for most complainants. The family that George raised during his years of service to Frank carried knowledge of what had occurred into subsequent generations, whose own experiences with police would vary, depending on circumstances that shifted over decades of social change. His children faced discrimination that resembled what he had endured, while his grandchildren encountered a landscape that had been partially transformed by movements that his generation had supported. The story was passed down through family gatherings, where elders shared experiences with younger members who might otherwise have assumed that the present represented the only possible configuration of racial dynamics in American society. Understanding that the past had been different and that change had occurred through struggle rather than inevitability provided context for assessing contemporary challenges and possibilities. Frank's role in the story remained central, his intervention demonstrating that allies from unexpected places could make differences that victims alone could not achieve. The lesson was not that Black Americans should depend on white saviors whose assistance might or might not materialize, but rather that solidarity across racial lines could amplify demands for justice when it was genuinely offered. The complexity of Frank's character made him an imperfect symbol for such solidarity, his treatment of some people contradicting the principles he had demonstrated in defending George. Biographers who examined his life in detail found patterns of generosity and cruelty, loyalty and vindictiveness, that resisted the simple narratives that admirers and critics respectively preferred. But the incident on Sunset Boulevard revealed something genuine about values that Frank held, a commitment to defending those in his employ that was not performative but deeply felt. Whatever his other qualities, his response to George's harassment demonstrated that he understood dignity as something worth fighting for, regardless of whose dignity was at stake. The Los Angeles that witnessed the confrontation between Frank and Officer Patterson has been transformed repeatedly in the decades since, its demographics, politics, and culture evolving through changes that would have astonished observers of the 1960s, who assumed that certain patterns were permanent. The police department that harassed George has undergone reforms, scandals, and transformations that have altered its character, without entirely eliminating the dynamics that produced the original incident. The limousine that was stopped on that August afternoon has long since been scrapped, its metal recycled into products whose users have no connection to the history that the vehicle once represented. The street where the encounter occurred remains, its traffic flowing with speeds and densities that differ from what George would have experienced, but that still include black motorists whose interactions with police reflect patterns that have proven remarkably persistent despite decades of advocacy for change. The story survives through documentation that historians have examined and through oral traditions that families have maintained despite the natural erosion of memory that time produces. Each retelling introduces variations that reflect the perspectives and purposes of those doing the telling, the core narrative remaining recognizable even as details shift to serve different emphases. Rest in peace, George Raymond Hoskins. Your decades of service behind the wheel carried more than passengers. They demonstrated loyalty that was rewarded with loyalty when the moment demanded it. And rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that moved millions also spoke for one man whose dignity had been violated by someone who thought that a uniform provided immunity from consequences. What you did that day proved that some employers recognize that their obligations extend beyond paychecks to encompass the fundamental human dignity of people who work for them. Officer Patterson learned that lesson at the cost of his career, and the chief of police learned it by personally apologizing to a black chauffeur whose complaint would otherwise have been ignored like countless others before and since.